Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Father-Son Packers podcast, your number one source for Packers news, notes, and analysis. My name is Tommy. I'm one of your hosts here, and join me, as always, is my dad, my co-host, Matt. Dad, how are you doing?
I'm doing well. We're here, first podcast post-NFL Combine.
Yep.
Lots of stuff to talk about. Oh, there's a lot of stuff to talk about.
Lots of stuff to talk about. You know, Combine is rumor week. Combine is one of the best data collecting points during the entire pre-draft process. There's a lot to talk about. Before we get to any of that... Oh, sorry, go ahead.
But speaking of, rumor week, there's apparently, I think a lot of the staffers, they spend a lot more time gossiping and talking to each other than they actually spend paying attention to any of the athletes.
Yes, it seems like it based on the talk we get, and getting to watch the guys work out is kind of an extra side bonus from all the chit chat they get done.
Right. They should just change the NFL rules so that the legal tampering period starts with the first day of the combine, because you know what's going on anyway.
Yes, and before we get to all this, we got a lot to talk about. A lot of Aaron Rodgers related rumors, mostly Aaron Rodgers related rumors, a few good injury news updates that came right before the combine after our last episode. But before we get to any of that, we just wanted to pitch a couple of things. If you enjoy what you hear, come give us a follow on Twitter at FatherSonPacker. We tweet out when we have new episodes. We're starting mock draft Mondays now that the draft is ramping up. We'll be tweeting a new mock draft every single Monday. We tweet articles that we find interesting, news and updates surrounding the Packers, etc., things like that. So come give us a follow on Twitter. Once again, that's at FatherSonPacker. If you really like this podcast, come subscribe to us on all platforms you can find, whether that's Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, anywhere you can find podcasts, you can find us. And if you really, really, really like us, come subscribe to us on YouTube. We post all of our episodes there as well, and that would really help us in terms of algorithm and just in terms of getting numbers up. And so we would appreciate all of that. But Dad, are you ready to get to it?
Let's get to it. There's a lot of stuff out there.
Yes.
And where should we start?
Well, let's lead it in. Let's start with the number one interest of all Packers fans right now, and that is Aaron Rodgers news. So a couple things to touch on. Number one, this is kind of Aaron Rodgers adjacent news, more quarterback market news, but since the last time we recorded, Derek Carr has officially signed with the Saints, 4 years, $150 million. And so that mostly takes an option off of the Jets table.
Yes,
and it's going to kind of lead into another piece of news that we're going to talk about in just a second. But it seemed like the Jets were really kind of between Rodgers and Carr in terms of quarterbacks they like the most, and now Carr is off the market. So, Dad, what do you think about that?
Well, they kept hyping up Carr. Oh, we're happy with Carr. Carr will be great here. We'll go with Carr. I mean, maybe we like Rodgers better, but Carr will be great. It's like, well, they can't say that anymore.
They didn't stop it great. They said Carr would be a Hall of Famer.
Hall of Famer.
That was preposterous, but all right. Gas him up, I
guess they're expecting him to win 4 Super Bowls in a row for the Jets.
I was telling you earlier, I was like, people don't think Eli Manning's a Hall of Famer. What's Derek Carr going to do in the next 4 years for the Jets where he's going to get past that? But whatever. So Derek Carr signing with the Saints clearly shows that either it was communicated, to me at least, it was communicated to him because it sounded like he wanted to sign with the Jets as well. And so it seems like it was either communicated from the Jets to him that they were going to wait for Aaron Rodgers, or they already kind of have a bit of a handshake, talked it out agreement where they are starting to have discussions with Rodgers. And that
I had this one of two ways. Either the Jets said, see ya, or Carr said, screw you.
Yeah, I'm not going to wait any longer. But either way, it seems like the Jets were content to miss out on Carr to wait for Rodgers because they're kind of in quarterback no man's land. They need a quarterback. They have the rest of the roster.
Anybody who watched the Jets this year knows they need a quarterback.
And that kind of brings us to the next point, and actually 2 more points. And so we're going to start with the Rich Eisen story that he had on the Rich Eisen show. We tweeted out the link to it. You can check on our Twitter. But essentially what he said, was doing a segment on the 5 biggest stories that he, news bits, pieces of rumor that he heard while he was at the Combine. And one of them was essentially that he heard, quote, over and over again, that the Packers are really hoping that Rodgers either wants to be traded or wants to retire. and they are really hoping that he does not want to try and run it back, which I think is really interesting. Obviously, it is smoke season. Like, people are trying to essentially cloudy up these things. It would be very beneficial to a team like the Jets if it was made clear, if it seemed like prevailing sentiment was that the Packers didn't want Rodgers anymore, because then they wouldn't have to trade as much for Rodgers. And so obviously there's that you need to consider, but I think it's still interesting. What do you think, Dad?
There's all kinds of rumors all over the map. If you believe Twitter and people's rumors about what the trade package should be for Rodgers, anywhere from, five first rounders, or we'll give you a ham sandwich, but we need a first rounder in return
to take the contract.
Take the contract off your hands.
But I do think it is different, though, when it is a rumor. Like, a rumor on Twitter is very different from a rumor that is being shared amongst NFL executives and coaches.
Yes.
And so I do think,
with Eisen reporting what he heard, he's like, well, he definitely heard something, and it sounded like he heard talk like this multiple times. It wasn't just once, right?
Yes, he explicitly said, like he's heard it from multiple different people, which is interesting. And then that kind of all circles around into what was just tweeted out about like 20 minutes before we started recording by Trey Wingo, who tweeted that the Jets and Rodgers, let me make sure I get this tweet exactly right, because I did just read it. So, per sources, Aaron Rodgers and the Jets had conversations today, that is Monday, March 6th. While nothing is imminent, Rodgers is open to the idea of going to New York. What do you make of that, Dad?
It sounds like something's happening.
Yes, I agree.
Something's happening. Where's this? This is the Office meme.
All right, everybody, stay calm. Oh my God, it's happening. Stay calm. But yeah, so I would say with all of these things kind of circling around, I mean, one story is one thing. A series of rumors is another thing. The fact that he's officially reported that he's meeting with the Jets, and the Packers would have to give him permission to meet with the Jets for it to not be tampering, I believe, as I understand it.
Yes, I think that's correct.
So it all kind of seems to be pointing that there might be something in the works here between the Packers and the Jets where something could happen. And I mean, I don't want to be like a shock jock journalist, but something could happen any day now. I would be surprised if something doesn't like either they cement that he's staying or that they trade him within the next week. I would be surprised if that doesn't happen.
Yeah, I'm expecting something in the next few days at this point, since we've already come this far.
Yeah.
And it was interesting, we had, I think also there was like the weird sort of Brandon Marshall thing of it all. Remember, it was like the tweet that
didn't do it for me.
But it wasn't even just that. It was like, but then you see that not just the kind of retirement congratulation thing, but then it's like, then after I said that, 4 teams contacted me. And then that was the only thing, that there were like 4 teams interested. Several people have used that number, and I don't know where that comes from.
Yeah,
but also you have these conflicting reports about, nobody's interested, they'll get him for a song. There are 4 teams interested, and lots of teams will want him.
Well, I was also going to.
It's all part of lying season.
Well, I was going to touch on the fact that I think we talked about last episode that the Raiders are no longer apparently an interested party. But there was a report that the Panthers made a call, but Adam Schefter reported that. And then Panthers beat reporters immediately said, there has been no call from the Panthers to the Packers. So make of that what you will. It's kind of, there's a lot of cooking going on. But I think the biggest...
and then there was another thing this week. It's like, the Raiders said they're out, but they're not really out. It came out, the story as well. So who knows? But this is the most concrete thing we've heard so far about Rodgers talking to the Jets. By
far the biggest. I mean, actual tangible, not just like, someone called someone. Like, this is Aaron Rodgers' meeting with the Jets. And I mean, step one is he has to be okay going somewhere, because he could just be like, I'm going to retire if you trade me somewhere I don't want to go.
He has de facto.
And the fact that at least Wingo is reporting that, like, he seems like he would be okay with going to the Jets. That's step one. Now, step two is getting the Jets to come to a price point that the Packers are okay with that trade. But, I mean, very interesting, and we'll keep monitoring it as we go. Anything else you wanted to touch on with the Rodgers situation? Because that's pretty much all we have, is that he's talking with the Jets.
I
the
think
Packers seem to be open to moving him, and that's kind of where we're going, and I think something happening is imminent.
Yeah, I think we've, worked this little tiny bit of news for enough content by now.
We could always work it for more. But anyway, yes. So that's kind of the main news surrounding Aaron Rodgers. And then just another small nugget of news is that both Rashawn Gary and Eric Stokes seem to be progressing well through their injury rehab. Stokes, I think, his goal is to be ready by training camp. And then Gary, I think his goal is to be ready by the start of the season. So both progressing very well. So that's definitely good news. And, just hoping for a speedy recovery for both of those guys. I know they're both really young, talented players on this defense that the Packers are going to need if they're going to be a good defense in 2023. But
it was nice actually to hear something about Stokes being ready for training camp, because we never really got a good description of what his injury was.
We never even got a video. They never even showed a replay.
They
we've talked about
this. they said, no, this is too gruesome for anybody to see.
Yeah,
so
ankle and
we're not going to show it again.
Yeah, ankle and knee injuries. But
what I've seen listed is an ankle. But anyway, this sounds like better news.
Yes. And so now this takes us to our Combine review. We talked a lot in our previous episode doing our Combine pre-draft show, our pre-Combine show about different thresholds the Packers have for a variety of positions. We talked about safeties, tight ends, D linemen, edges, and wide receivers, essentially talking about all of the players the Packers have drafted under Gutekunst and essentially where their different measurable and athletic testing thresholds seem to cluster for these different positions. If you want to listen to that, go check out wherever you're listening to this podcast. It'll be the podcast previously. Some really good work done by you, Dad, collecting all that data and looking at it and looking at the clusters there. But so now that we have this Combine data, I think what we're going to do here is just talk about some positive takeaways in terms of like through a Packers lens and some negative things through a Packers lens that we kind of have some as our takeaways essentially from this Combine. Dad, do you want to start us off? We'll go positive, negative, positive, negative, positive, and you just start with whichever your first positive is, and then I'll follow up.
All right, so I'll go first. So I'll start with my positives, and what I have first is tight end class depth.
Yes,
and tight end is a even admitted by Gutekunst position of need this offseason. And I think all the fans think, okay, we need to add one, possibly two tight ends. Whether we add two through the draft or one through the draft and one free agent, maybe we even add three. We sign, even if it counting one of those, a free agent signing is re-signing Tunyon. But one thing that we talked about last time is the high correlation, or maybe one of the most recent times, the high correlation between athleticism at the tight end position and production at the NFL level. And I think we looked over like the top 5 players in yardage for the year and how the vast majority of them were elite athletes. And so it looks like this is a good year to need tight ends in the draft. So before the Combine, there were already 5 or 6 tight ends projected to go in the first 2 rounds on a lot of different draft sites. And and now we have test numbers for most of them. Michael Mayer, who a lot of people think will be the top tight end, he came out, and so I'm going to be just referring to RAS, a relative athletic score, and not break out the different. At this point, we'll go into more detail maybe in a later episode about what we think the individual tests that matter more for each position are. But for now, I'm just going to use the RAS site, the RAS scores.
Shout out Kentley Platt at MathBomb on Twitter. He is the one who developed RAS as a measurement system. He's a great follow on Twitter at MathBomb. MathBomb. So, 5 of the 6 who tested are like scored as like good to great or better, and some elite top of the chart. So, Mayer, a lot of people think as the first tight end, though that's becoming a little more fluid. He actually had the lowest score of the group at 8.08. I'm going to tell you
RAS out of 10.
I'm going to tell you, no shade, I expected it to be lower.
Right. It was actually better than you expected. It was good enough that you feel like, okay, he could actually do something at the NFL level. In fact, for this group, of the 14 who tested, only 1 out of the 14 had a RAS below 8.
For reference, what was his RAS? The one who was
8
the 14th? Who was the 14th one, the lowest? Do you remember?
Oh, the one who didn't?
Yeah.
I cannot remember. He is not somebody expected maybe to be drafted at all.
Pretty much what I was going to say was the two tight ends the Packers have drafted under Gutekunst were both had RASs under 8. So almost any tight end they drafted that tested today is a better athlete than either of the guys they drafted in Sternberger or DeGuara.
Yeah, there's one guy who was in the 4s, maybe he was in the 3s, and I don't think he's like rated high enough in the draft sites to actually expect to be drafted. So I went, because he didn't come up in my list of the draftees. So I used so that Dalton Kincaid, he's I think got a back issue, so he didn't do any testing. Darnell Washington, 6'7" monster, who's also an athletic freak, at a 9.85.
Did you see his free cone?
Incredible agility scores. Second best in the draft at all positions combined.
The only person on a better free cone than him is Jackson Smith and Jigba, who's 7 inches shorter and like 100 pounds lighter.
100 pounds or 80 pounds lighter.
80 pounds lighter. But still, this is the only guy that moved like him. That's incredible.
It's insane.
And you see Washington move the sled with just freakish ease. Honestly, I'm at the point where it's like, and he kind of got me in his interview as well because he said, I think they asked him like what tight end he models his game after, and he said Mercedes Lewis, or favorite tight end. He said Mercedes Lewis. Like, yep, Pat, check. Like, if they want to take him at 15, I wouldn't hate it.
It happened now.
Yeah.
Luke Musgrave was 9.95, Sam Laporta 9.26, and then possibly Tucker Kraft.
Laporta's still my guy. Laporta is still my guy.
And these are the 5 or 6 who have mostly been in the first 2 round conversation. There are a whole lot of other tight ends who are expected to go round 3 or later, using the draftnetwork.com's overall rank to kind of place them in the buckets of which round. So that is an estimate, and I could have used a bunch of other sites or tried to go through the trouble of getting a consensus. But for this, I just wanted to look at who. So in the 4th round, there's Benton Strange, who had an 8.92. 5th round, Davis Allen, 8.77. Luke Schoonmaker, I think is how you pronounce his name, 9.75. In the 6th round, Zach Kuntz, who actually had the best score, despite the fact that Darnell Washington was a athletic freak, he didn't even have the best athletic testing score overall. That was Zach Kuntz, who had a 10.0, 6'7", 255-pound tight end, who had, I think, the fastest 40, and I forget what else he did.
Penn State knows how to prep their guys for the Combine. I don't know if you remember, like 3 years ago, Mike Gesicki absolutely annihilated the Combine.
Though he finished at Old Dominion. So he started at Penn State and then transferred to Old Dominion. So he had his last 2 years, and this last year was cut short by injury at Old Dominion, but had a pretty productive year before last. So he didn't finish it at Penn State. And then another projected 6th round of Jerome Payne, 8.18, and then 2 either 7th round or UDFA, depending on how deep go, Will Mallory and Josh Weil, like 9.19 and 8.86.
But so the point of it is that there are a lot of athletic tight ends the Packers have to pick from, and there are a lot of the top tight ends tested out as elite athletes as well, which is always a good sign for a tight end prospect.
Right, and so I think the Packers can get maybe they'll get one tight end early, one of the projected stars, but then you could still, which seems to pay off a lot, get a later round flyer on an athlete. Yeah. And a lot of the top tight ends are not actually early round draft picks.
Yeah. And so, I think the big thing is like the Packers, like I think it's just DeGuara under contract for next year right now. Mercedes Lewis.
Yes, because not even Tyler Davis is under contract right now.
Yeah. It's like they have one guy in the room if they started the season tomorrow. They need tight ends badly.
And just to also talk about how good this class is, so they have 7 in the class already, and Kincaid may make it 8 with a RAS over 9. So last year was also a pretty good year. There were 6, but in 2021 there were only 3, and in 2020 there were only 2.
Yeah, it's working out to be a historic tight end class. I've seen people talk about could it be like the first year that more tight ends are taken in the first round than receivers? I think Hayden Winks of Underdog Fantasy said that on their podcast, which is a great podcast. You should give it a listen. And then I think Daniel Jeremiah, I believe, said that he wouldn't be surprised if 3 tight ends went in the first round. And we don't need to hit tight end too heavily, but it's a big need for the Packers, and there looks like there's going to be a lot of options there for them.
Yep.
Do you want to move on to my next positive?
Yeah, so why don't you go on to your next positive?
Okay. And
your first positive.
Yeah, so my first positive was first-round defensive tackle athleticism. Now, in terms of players that were going to be there that the Packers might take, Packers, I think, do have a need at interior defensive line. I know that Wyatt will most likely be taking a lot more snaps next year, but Lowry and Reed are most likely going to be gone. So that leaves essentially 2 of their 4 highest snap takers along the defensive line last year. Just you need to fill those snaps. So I wouldn't be surprised at all if they take a defensive lineman in the first round. And there were 3 guys that particularly stood out to me, going into like the combine, where I was like, yeah, I like what these guys have put on tape so far. I think that the Packers could take them there at pick 15 if they decide to go that route. And that was, the first one was Brian Brzee out of Clemson. Had a RAS of 9.04, 6'5.5", 298 pounds, 32.5-inch arms, which is about average, maybe slightly below. Only a 29-inch vertical, which is average, and didn't broad jump. So that's going to be interesting to see if he does that on his pro day. And I'm sure the Packers will be keeping a close eye on that because they do care about the broad jump for most positions. But a 4.86 40, which is very fast with elite 10 and 20-yard times. He has like slightly shorter-ish arms. Actually, that 32.5 is a bit below average, especially for his height at 6'5". But he's definitely one to keep an eye on. The other one,
and I would just add, you said that 29-inch vertical is average, but it is a vertical that they've had several of their draftees hit before. Wyatt, Ford, and Slayton all hit 29-inch vertical.
Yeah. And then the next one was Kalijah Cansey. He did not do the jumps, but he did run a blistering 4.67 40 at 6'1", 281 pounds, time, which is absurd, with elite 10 and 20-yard splits. However, he's getting a lot of Aaron Donald comps because he's a smaller interior defensive lineman from Pitt who like rushes the passer. His arms are really short. I'm talking like first percentile short arms, like 30-inch arms, like very short, like 2 inches shorter than Aaron Donald's. So that's a little scary. And so that's someone they could take a look at. When I watch him play, like he looks really dynamic. I mean, they're playing him like straight up at nose, like or like kind of shaded to the center, like he's having to take on double teams. And he looks really good. He looks really explosive. And I would imagine like when he does his jumps at his pro day, they're going to be insane. But they don't have that right now, so he doesn't even have a RAS because he hasn't completed enough drills. But he's one to keep an eye on for the Packers just because I think he's going to test out of his mind, and the biggest question is what the arm length concerns are going to be. And then the last one is Adetomiwa Adebawore out of Northwestern, I believe. And my goodness, I mean, a RAS of 9.85. So what that breaks down is 6'1" and 5/8 inches, 282 pounds, 33 and 7/8 inch arms, which is long. I mean, his arms are longer than Brian Brzee's, and Brian Brzee is 4 inches taller than him. A 4.49 40. He ran faster than almost every safety in this class, which we're about to talk about. Like, he's 60 pounds, like heavier than every safety, and ran faster than almost every single one. With elite 10 and 20-yard splits, a 37.5-inch vert, a 10-foot 5-inch broad, and 27 reps on the bench. I mean, he just obliterated the combine, and he was someone that was going like mid-second, early third. I'd be kind of surprised if he didn't go late first, at least right now, with what he just put at the combine. Like, people are going to bet on athletic traits like that. And he's the type of guy that I think the Packers might just take and be like, hey, it's a bit of a project. I mean, he's a freak. You can't teach those kind of numbers, like, at all. And like he looks pretty good playing as well.
So here's the question. Is he going to play more, and I don't know how he lined up in college, edge or D-tackle?
That is the question. He's a little big for edge, 281. He's a little small for tackle. He worked out with the D-tackles. And so I'm thinking that's probably where he's leaning, or what teams have told him. Because usually like they have them work out with what teams have told them they're looking at him.
To do a certain, yeah.
Yeah, so I would imagine their teams are looking at him for D-tackle, but that is a good question.
And maybe he'll be able to do both. He'll line up inside, like kind of what Z was doing. He'll line up outside and inside and split time.
Yeah, I mean,
in alignment.
He's just a freak. But just essentially the positive is there are a lot of elite athletes at the defensive tackle position.
Yeah, and one thing I wanted to add about Cansey is I think he did very well in the 101s at the Senior Bowl. If I've got it right.
I think your word for it. I trust your memory.
I'm trying to remember. I've looked at so many 101s, I forget now how many players I looked at, and I know I can't remember if he was one of the ones I looked at or not. I think so.
I trust you on that. But yeah, so that's my first positive is that do you tackle athleticism? Like a lot of those mid first round pick guys tested really well and are probably the type of athlete that the Packers would look at and the type of player that the Packers would look at. So for them not to like kind of test their way out of the Packers thresholds is good. Do you want to give us your first negative?
Yeah, so we just kind of referred to it. My first negative from the combine is the speed of the safety class.
Just the safety class in general, just the athletic testing of the safety class was putrid. It was so bad. Yeah. What was it? I think I don't want to steal your thunder, but no, go ahead. I won't steal your thunder.
And I was trying to remember what the average was for the league, and
the average of a drafted safety, I believe I heard was 4.52.
Okay, that's what I had, and it's like, Tommy, do I have this number right? Because this is what I remember. That was 4.52. So, and also the other thing I put in, I expanded the Packers safeties that I looked at from our last podcast to all the Packers who had a decent number of snaps over the last 5 years. So even including, Ibrahim Campbell, Josh Jones, Kentrell Bryce, Clinton Dix. And so over the last 5 years, the slowest Packer safety with any meaningful snaps was Clinton Dix at 4.58, and the team average was 4.49. This year in the combine, only 7 safeties beat that league average 4.52 number.
Yeah.
And when looking, and remember we were talking about this kind of long term before about Savage as a safety or not, and if we want to look for somebody, to kind of take his safety role, if he's going to this is going to be his last year on the team, or if he's going to move full time to nickel. There is no one in the class with his speed, which is 4.36. There's just no one. The closest is Brandon Hill at 4.43, and he's projected to go day 3. He's not even a highly regarded safety.
Yeah, and it seems like all of the highly regarded safeties, none of them tested well. Not even my guy Jair Brown out of Penn State, who I was really high on, tested awfully. Brian Branch out of Alabama did not test well. He was probably the only safety that was really getting mocked in first rounds. I'd be a little surprised if any safeties went in the first round now.
They might not. Yeah, so he's another guy who we'd comparing to Savage because he played a lot in the slot in college. But even though he's a little taller than Savage, he's actually lighter and ran a 4.58 compared to Savage's 4.36. Yeah. Though he still may be one of the better safety prospects, kind of depending on what you're looking for. This is something I need to spend a little more time at, looking at their athletic scores, their
but Branch might be a slot corner only. He might not even be a real safety.
Yeah. But yeah, so we'll see. And that because looking for players who have a decent coverage grade, a decent run stop grade in terms of not missing too many tackles, and having good testing. The players who had like the best athletic testing, probably like Sidney Brown, project to go second round, and then a later round picks Brandon Hill and Daniel Scott, who are going to be like a late day 3 picks likely. But then there's some players who didn't test, like J.L. Skinner for Boise State.
Yeah, he tore his pec right before the
testing. He's a player I'll be keeping an eye on if he is ready to work out by his pro day, because he's had put up some good tape, I think, as well as play. So we'll see if that changes anything. But still, it's not like there are this depth of safeties we'll be able to get like a high end athlete as a wild card to hope for something in day 3.
Yeah, it's just like none of the top rated guys tested well, and I think this almost like they're going to have to pivot to get at least one guy in free agency, because during his combine presser, Gutekunst essentially said we need to fill both of those spots at safety, pretty much just confirming that, yeah, we're going to have 2 new starting safeties next year, or at least a lot of competition at those spots. And so you're not getting both of those guys in the draft. Like,
yeah, I think they're definitely going to sign one good safety. So they may be spending like almost all of their free agent capital on safety. I expect they may also sign one on a tight end. So maybe
it's so
like
hard though,
they'll
because
free up enough money to get like $15 million they can spend on 2 free agents to get a safety and a tight end.
It's just
that's like
so
$50
tough.
million this year. You could work the numbers to have the cap hit later.
It's just so hard because like it's not a very strong free agency class overall, but there are a lot of teams with a lot of money to spend. And so I think the Packers are going to get priced out like by all these teams that have money with nothing to spend it on. They might as well just throw a few dollars around.
Hopefully they don't need safeties.
I mean,
or tight ends.
Yeah, but I think the top one is going to be Jesse Bates, but there's no way they're going to be able to afford him.
No, this is going to be like, what is he like projected on spot track to be like 12 million, 14 million?
Something crazy like that. But
there's some other guys who, we could go into the free agency a little bit later.
Let's move on to,
I suspect they'll get somebody. So what's your negative? What's your first negative?
My first negative for the combine is the size of the top end receivers. So we talked a little bit about that in that pre-combine episode about how the Packers prefer to draft taller receivers. 3 of the 7 of their receivers that they've taken under Gutekunst fall in the 90th percentile of height, which is around 6'4". But even when they take a smaller guy, like an Amari Rodgers, they need to be bulkier. So Amari Rodgers was like 5'9.5", but he weighed 215 pounds. And the smallest guy they've taken was Samori Toure in the 7th round, who was like 195 pounds. So they do not like
191.
191.
But he was over 6 feet.
Yeah, but he's over 6 feet and a 7th rounder. So that's the smallest guy they've taken. Of PFF's top 5 receivers in this class, 3 of them would be the smallest ever drafted by Gutekunst. Zay Flowers, 5'10", 172. Jordan Addison, 6 foot, 175. And Josh Downs, 5'10", 175. So that's looking at PFF's essentially big board, and those are 3 guys are all in the top 5. But all 3 of those guys are pretty much too small for Gutekunst thresholds and would be a major outlier in terms of his drafting pattern so far. And then you go down the list, 5 of the top 10 are too small. That's adding in Tank Dell, who's 5'10", 165, and Jalen Hyatt, who's 6'1", 180. I mean, these guys are really small, and I know when Gutekunst drafted Amari Rodgers, he made a point. He said he's short, but he's not a small man. And so it seems like he was essentially defending and saying, no, we're not drafting small guys. Like, he's still big. Essentially just intimating that we're drafting bigger receivers. We want size at the receiver position. Even if it doesn't necessarily equate to height, he wants bigger guys at the receiver position. And so a lot of these top guys, if you're looking at receiver this year, are small. And so
and they're not, it's not like they're just a little smaller. They're like really 20, small. 25 pounds lower than the threshold.
Yeah. It's like, it's not even close. And I mean, and even the guys who are touching like 180, like Hyatt and Addison, I mean, they're over 6 feet tall, so they're built like sticks. So like you could say, hey, like Addison's 6 foot 175. I mean, that's still 17 pounds or 16 pounds lighter than Toure, like at the same height. Yeah. That's really small. And maybe they make an exception for a guy like him where he's such a good route runner, but he didn't even necessarily run very well. I mean, he ran a 4.49, which is good, but the rest of the drills were only okay. And then Hyatt, maybe they make an exception because he's so dang fast. I think he ran a 4.39 in the end, which is very fast. I know some people thought he might run faster, but I mean, maybe they make exceptions for guys that they think are like supremely skilled or have a special trait like speed, but they haven't in the past. And I just don't see, like, I feel like a lot of these options at receivers have almost been already knocked out as potential options just by how big they are. And, you know, maybe they go outside of thresholds, but they haven't in the past. So,
yeah, we'll see if they do, because last year they did kind of break their trends with the 2 first-round picks. Though you do generally feel like they're going to stick more to their thresholds for higher picks and maybe break them later, like they did for Toure for a 7th rounder.
Yep. And so that's my negative. Do you want to go on to your next positive?
Sure. I'll go to my next positive, which is that you talked about the D lineman in the first round. And I was looking at I think there are also some athletic D linemen that are projected for day 2 or 3 where the Packers could add some depth, even if they picked up someone early. I wouldn't surprise me if they take 2 D linemen in this draft. And I think if they didn't get somebody early, I think they could still get possible contributors from day 2. Some day 2, some day 3. So on day 2, you have Keanu Benton from Wisconsin, and his RAS of 8.65. So I'm looking at their athletic score again. So these, not looking at production at this point, how well they did in college, but what we've learned from the combine. And Benton, I think, also did very well at the 101s in the Senior Bowl. Some of these guys, I don't know much about them. Another a couple more day 2 projected. This is again, I think, from projections from the Draft Network. Gervin Dexter, who had a 9.21, and Colby Wooden, who had a 9.01. There are some additional athletic profiles for D linemen in day 3, and maybe some of these projections may change after the combine, and it just hasn't been updated yet, and they may start getting more like 2nd, 3rd round buzz for some of these guys instead of 4th, 5th, and 6th round buzz. But Moro Ojomo from Texas is a guy who had some nice numbers in, I think, the speed and explosion drills. Had 8.56. Zach Pickens, who I've heard a number of people mock to the Packers a few weeks ago, he had an 8.97. From South Carolina. I don't remember the schools for all of these guys. Jalen Redmond, a 9.63, and Dante Stills, an 8.44. So even on day 3, there are still like 4 defensive tackles who look like they're have a nice athletic upside. And then there are always, I think, some additional. We talked about this last time, that the D tackle really has 2 different kinds of players. They're the pass rushing ends and it's got a run stuffing nose tackle in the middle, like more like a Slayton kind of profile than a Wyatt kind of profile. But there are going to be some possible big run stuffers available late, as well as some of these more athletic possible pass rushing juice guys who might end up more as a 3-4 end instead of a nose.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, I mean, I think they need, like I said, they're going to be missing Reed and Lowry probably next year. They're going to need D-line help, and I wouldn't be surprised if they take 3. I mean, we know they like double and triple dipping at these positions where they have these weaknesses. I know they kind of have a lot of weaknesses right now, so maybe they won't have the luxury of doing that. But also, there seems like there are going to be opportunities there.
And that wouldn't surprise me if somebody falls to them in the first round, like Brissy, and they'll grab him and then add one of these other guys in like the 4th, 5th, or 6th round as a second D lineman, and try to get one of these whoever's still on the board as athletic and one of those kind of
But I also think it's going to depend on how many first rounders they have. Like if they trade Rodgers and if they don't, are 2 completely different things.
Yes, a lot of these are making a lot of my what they might pick assumptions are being driven by having 2 firsts and 2 seconds.
Yeah. For my second positive, it was that it seems like there are going to be 4 quarterbacks going before the Packers pick, with how well Stroud threw during the drills, with how well Anthony Richardson looked like the greatest athlete at the quarterback position of all time at the combine.
Of all time, yeah. I think he broke
like the vertical record. I think he was close to breaking the 40-yard dash record for a quarterback. Just annihilated every single drill. And then Levis apparently, I didn't keep a super close eye on the quarterbacks, but I think Levis did pretty well as well. And then, help me out, the guy out of Alabama. The main guy, the guy who's going to go first overall.
Young.
Yes, Bryce Young. Thank you. But so it's seeming like all four of those guys will probably go before pick 15 at this point, which is good for the Packers because that means players at positions that they actually need are going to get driven down the board. So they'll essentially have their pick at like a top 11 non-quarterback player, which, is good. And also there's some downside that some of these more quarterback needy teams are going to draft a quarterback. And so there's less competition to trade for Aaron Rodgers and drive the price up. But it is what it is. They're going to have a better chance at drafting a good player with all these other teams taking quarterbacks ahead of them.
Yeah, I think with the Richardson combine, any thought of him still being around and being
not a chance
drafted after the Packers pick is never going to happen now.
Not a prayer. And the thing is, it's like maybe people are saying maybe he makes 15, you trade down.
Maybe he's going to be number 1 overall now.
There's talk.
There's some chatter about it. I don't know how much of it is real.
I mean, Bryce Young didn't throw at the combine, which was kind of a underrated story. I mean, he came in, hit the 200-pound mark, and said, "I'm going home."
Right. He showed up. He showed up big enough.
Yes.
He was, 5'10" and change, and over 200. And people were afraid he was going to be like 170 or something like these receivers.
We all know he was not playing at 200.
He was on like the king size Homer diet.
He had weights in his socks. He had change in his pockets.
I remember who was it? Some offensive lineman or something was telling a story about wearing like iron pants under his sweats or something for the team weighs weekly. So he would.
You can't get away with that as a combine.
They can't get away with it.
But so that's my second positive is that there are going to be 4 quarterbacks going ahead of the Packers, so they'll have a better chance of getting a good player at 15.
He was just on the Dr. Nick king size Homer diet.
Yeah, I mean they clearly were just like the goal of the combine for us is to weigh in above 200 pounds so that athletically we're comparable to Kyler. I think is the big thing because now he's about the same height and weight as Kyler. But Dad, what was your last negative?
Negative.
I think ours are pretty similar on the last negative.
Was about the O-line and how we didn't. So I think some information in the last few years come out about this short shuttle being really the best predictor for O-line performance. And this is, I think, what I found was like Josh Norris and Kevin Cole were commenting on this Twitter fairly recently, I believe, that the best correlation is between short shuttle and offensive lineman success. And I think it's not just tackle, but I'd have to double check on that. But what I mentioned is that 24 out of 28 O-linemen who ran 4.47 or better were drafted, and they went on to start 84% of their team's games. So only one offensive lineman who ran the short shuttle was better than 4.47. But the problem is, like, out of this year's combine,
which guy was that again?
Oh shoot! I'd have to go back in and look at that.
I'll look while you.
There are only 25 O linemen who actually ran the short shuttle. So that's the problem. Is like most of the top O linemen didn't even bother to do it. So you don't really have a good. I think the best measure, it seems to be, is something that they didn't do. Maybe some of them will do it at the pro day, and so we'll get some more information about them to try to figure out who might be a good fit. And sometimes this is a way Packers, I think, have picked up some later round flyers who have turned out to be good, like Zach Tom. Did he beat this threshold? He was just such a good tester in so many ways. He was right at 4.47.
I'm looking at it now. I believe it was John Gaines out of UCLA.
Yes, from UCLA. Guard from UCLA. He was the one. Yeah, I recognize his name because I think I picked him in one of my many, many mock drafts recently.
Yeah, so he's going to be one to keep an eye on in later rounds. He's probably a day 2 guy at this point, right? I mean, he tested out of his mind as well.
That's true. He might move up into the second round with that. I don't think he was in the second round before, but I can't remember. I haven't been looking to draft guards that early.
Yeah.
So he's not a late day 3 anyway, ever, because it was never on my boards. So, but this may push him into day 2.
Yeah, and my second negative is kind of similar to yours, but it was just that lots of players didn't really work out at all and are choosing to wait for their pro days, which, like, more power to him. It's a more controlled environment. You can kind of get up your weight at the combine and then slim down a little bit and test a little better at your pro day. But guys like Miles Murphy didn't work out. Smith and Jigba and Quentin Johnston didn't run 40s. Devin Witherspoon, the corner out of I think Syracuse is it, who is expected to be the best corner or best or second best corner in this class, didn't test. Mozzie Smith, nose tackle out of Michigan, didn't work out at all. I mean, just it kind of goes down and down the list, but essentially a lot of players didn't test, so we don't really have numbers for them. Pro day numbers are always also a little less controlled, a little harder to trust because these schools have a vested interest in these players testing well. So sometimes there's shenanigans going on with some of that pro day testing. I mean, obviously the teams aren't necessarily fooled at all because they have their own guys there doing all the measurements themselves, but the stuff that the schools post is usually a little bit doctored. But yeah, so it's just
and some
it's
of these players that were very interested for the Packers, like Smith and Jigba and Quentin Johnston, are some of the few early round receivers who are meet or close enough to some of the Packers thresholds. And Mozzie Smith is somebody I've heard a lot of people interested as a potential D lineman for the Packers in the second round.
Yeah, but so it just kind of sucks that a lot of guys didn't work out. I mean, totally get it. But it's a little tough for the Packers and for people who like following the draft. But Dad, what was your last positive? Let's end on a good note.
So my last positive, even though it didn't seem like, a lot of the top end wide receivers were meeting the Packers' size thresholds, there are still going to be some receivers in the later rounds and on day 3 to try to build depth like they did last year with Dobbs and Toure, and it seemed like they've hit with Dobbs, potential long-term starter. So using like a 4.48 40, which was like EQ's 40, and then a 200 pounds, which seems to be a threshold for almost all the receivers except Samori Toure. Possible day 3 wide receivers that meet these thresholds are Andre Yosivas from Princeton, Matt Landers from Arkansas, Bryce Ford Wheaton, who had an amazing combine. I don't actually
someone's going to take a chance on him because I think he had like almost a 10 RAS. Like he
may have had the best RAS for all the wide receivers. So not particularly productive, and I think only the second most productive receiver on his team. So this is one thing I'd have to go through these more to see. One of the better predictor, actual production in college is a really good predictor for how a receiver is going to do in the pros, but I think you want to try to find the people who have done both. Other receivers to met these thresholds, Jacob Copeland from Maryland and Jonathan Mingo from Mississippi, meeting both of these height and speed thresholds. If you lower the weight to 191 using Toure's, which is the only one the Packers have drafted under 200 pounds, you could add another couple candidates in Trey Palmer from Nebraska and A.T. Perry from Wake Forest. So there are some possible receivers that the Packers could still take and still fit within their thresholds that they've shown in the past. So, and I think they will. I think they might take. They might even draft 3 receivers this year if they aren't able to bring anybody back, because they don't have that many on the team right now under contract.
Yeah, and I think just the fact that there's a lot of like essentially height, weight, speed freak athletes available late, and that's the kind of guys they like to take. Like that's what MVS was. Like that's what Equanimeous St. Brown was in a lot of ways. Like those are the guys they like taking.
They were 5th and 6th rounders.
Yep. And, I would say both of those very successful. I mean, for a 6th rounder, Equanimeous St. Brown's still in the league. Like, that's great. And MVS, I mean, he's got a ring now. So
he's got a ring and $10 million a year contract. And at EQ, I think if he didn't get hurt early on, he may have done more with the Packers.
Yeah.
It's always hard to tell.
And then my final positive is mostly associated with Brian Gutekunst's presser, and that it seems like the Packers are aware of their needs. According to Jackson's... So, from the presser... Gutekunst specifically mentioned safety and tight end as positions of need. Like we said earlier, he said essentially they're probably going to need 2 new starting safeties or fill both spots, I think was the language that he used. And then he mentioned tight end as well as a big need. And then based on a lot of reporting around the combine, they met with like 4 or 5 of the top tight ends already during the combine. And then Jackson Smith and Jigba, they met with as well. And he said during his interview that the Packers are, quote, definitely looking for a receiver, end quote. So it seems like the Packers like have like defined needs that they see as like, hey, here's where the roster needs improvement. And I think they kind of align with how most people view the roster. And so that's kind of just like my last like tacking on positive that, hey, they know what the problems are and they know where this roster needs shoring up. And it seems that they're like doing that due diligence at those positions.
They met with a number of the top receivers as well.
Yeah, they met with Johnston. They met with who else they meet with?
I think they met with Zay Flowers. They even met with guys who don't meet their thresholds. Yeah,
that's interesting. I had not seen the Zay Flowers one.
I think it was Zay Flowers. I don't remember about Hyatt. Maybe it was Hyatt. But they weren't sticking to the thresholds in the meetings that were reported.
That's interesting. Something to keep an eye on. But anyway, Dad, anything you wanted to tack on before we wrap up here?
I would just say that one thing you see from the meetings is they may not necessarily take that player, but it often means they'll take somebody in that position.
Yes,
when they're meeting with individual players.
Yeah, agreed. But anyway, thanks so much for listening. This has been our Combine breakdown of the 2023 NFL Combine. Like we said, if you like what you heard, come give us a follow on Twitter at FatherSonPacker. Come find us on YouTube, any other podcast platform. We'll be probably trying to do an emergency episode if any Aaron Rodgers news drops soon. So follow us on Twitter for keeping up with that. And then we'll be posting Mock Draft Mondays every single Monday. We'll be doing 1 episode a week for the rest of the offseason. And until next time, go Pack Go.
Go Pack Go.